Now is a good time for me to make a few remarks that I feel are essential. You may have read in Romanian history books about the feudal age and the feudal system. However, we must employ these terms carefully to avoid their political connotation. Lately, when we say feudal age, we are actually referring to the rule of the boyars, which survived well into the 19th century. This is, quite simply, misuse of language. The feudal system was a political regime that emerged in France around the time of Charlemagne's descendants, the Carolingians, and the 9th and 10th centuries, during the never-ending raids of the Saracens in the south and Vikings in the north, when the authority of the king, powerless to protect his subjects, broke down, and part of his political, military, and even some financial and judicial prerogatives were ceded to local rulers such as the Duke of Brittany, the Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Toulouse, etc. We then see France developing into a pyramid-like structure in which state unity is almost extinct or at best feeble, dependent on the loyalty to one man anointed by God, the king. The one thing that remained was the oath of the vassal to his suzerain. This system has never existed in our principalities as such. The great boyars never inherited their titles or the right to collect taxes or to dispense justice on their estates, not even the great Ban of Craiova. Only very rarely did Romanian voivodes temporarily grant their boyars or some monastery they wished to honor such privileges, and it was estimated that they never cover more than 20% of the country territory. The highest-ranking noble in Wallachia, the great Ban of Craiova, was never able to pass down his title to his sons. No boyar could do so. Only at the end of 15th century and at the beginning of the 16th century, but not interruptedly, were several generations of the same family appointed Great Ban, subsequently known as the Craiovești. It follows that it is incorrect to speak of a feudal system in our past at last in the sense it had in the Western Europe. Our voivodeships made use of a system inherited from the Bulgarians and Byzantium, a powerful nobility, the boyars, which inherited their noble status but not their titles, and which never formed that pyramid of vassalage through which authority and executive power were passed down as they were in the West. If we were ever part of a feudal system, it would be in a wider political context, by virtue of the fact that our voivodes were, intermittently, vassals to the kings of Hungary or the kings of Poland, and thus integrated in a Western-style feudal establishment. But, in my opinion, we have never had anything of this kind domestically, so it is better to avoid this term when referring to our country. To make matters clear, let us consider the three essential characteristics of Western feudalism and try to identify them in our history. 1. The monarch. Whether an emperor, king, or duke, had lost some of the prerogatives he had held over his subjects and was forced by necessity to delegate them to his most important vassals, as he was no longer able to defend the entire country. For example, the King of France was only very rarely in direct contact with his subjects in Brittany, Normandy, Burgundy, Provence, or Gascony, who now depended on their respective dukes or counts. The king was no longer a true sovereign, only a suzerain of his vassals, to which he had ceded almost all his royal prerogatives. A vassal's oath of loyalty was considered sacred, given on one knee, his hands held by those of his master. If the suzerain went to war, his vassals had the duty to provide him with a certain number of knights, servants, and provisions that would join the king's private retinue to form the country's army. The authority of the state had thus devolved to a pyramidal structure. The second characteristic, already briefly mentioned, is the surrender of the main royal entitlements, especially the right to raise taxes and administer justice. The suzerain only maintained the right to sit in the judgment on appeals and received a relatively low cash allowance. Moreover, his military weakness made the rights he did keep difficult to enforce, especially the call to arms, which could very well go unpunished. Thirdly, or last but not least, the rule over a domain, large or small, as well as the title that sanctioned it. Duke, Marquis, Count, Baron, etc. were hereditary. And as the original reason for the devolution of royal authority had been the inability of the monarch to protect the populace against barbarian raids, each vassal began to build himself one or more castle for that purpose, but not only. He may have well used it to plunder his own subjects or to find his neighbors in feuds over land or prestige. Very few traits of the Western feudal system were found in medieval Wallachia and Moldavia. Our boyars were very powerful indeed. They owned vast estates, hundreds of serfs, and multitudes of servants. They elected a voivode and governed alongside him. They led armies as spătari and commanded the large border fortresses as părcălabi, but never did they build castles on the land nor pass down their titles to their heirs, and so these never became hereditary. For these reasons, I must emphasize again that the term feudal should be avoided when talking about Romanian history, as doing so would only amount to political motivated misuse of the language.